change is reflected more strongly in heat waves than in any other phenomenon. And so compared to hurricanes, they are relatively easy to model. It's important to note that Allen watched from his apartment. He watched the Thames River rise as he wrote his 2003 paper. And the model he put forth doubled the risk of extreme heat waves given the higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And why this was landmark is because prior to this study, it usually, the way that it was reported in the media, went something like this, as described in this article, right? After some extreme weather events, reporters would ask a climate scientist whether the flood, drought, hurricane, disease, outbreak, wildfire, or superstorm happened because of climate change. And that scientist would typically respond something like, well, of course, one can never ascribe any single weather event to a changing global climate. However, we do know that the way that we're warming the planet must be contributing in some way. But this was different in terms of what Allen and then his colleagues and students were able to produce is definitive proof that we could attribute these extreme weather events to rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere and the burning of fossil fuels. And this was done most prevalently by Dr. Freddie Otto, who was a student of Allen's at Oxford. In her landmark study, Angry Weather, it analyzed the 2010 heat wave in Russia that killed 55,000 people. Had climate change made the heat wave more likely, she posed? The answer that she determined was a resounding yes. Her work and the work that her partnering colleagues helped cement extreme event attribution as a legitimate branch of climate science. And as she also stated quite forcefully, science can be a tool for justice. Extreme heat attribution is the first science ever developed with the court in mind. And so, after decades of inaction by world governments, the very purpose of this work, right, was to give client activists, to give citizens around the world the kind of proof that they need that they can actually take the perpetrators of the rising levels of CO2 in our atmosphere and the burning of fossil fuels to court to sue, because now they can directly attribute climate disasters to the rising temperature. And we're going to hear from Otto in her own words in this short little YouTube video clip.
Whenever an extreme weather event impacts society through flooding or excessive heat, for example, people ask the question whether human-induced climate change played a role. Scientists are now able to answer this question for many different extreme weather events. However, the answer you will get depends on how exactly you ask the question. In this commentary, we discuss how the attribution question determines the answer. Human-induced climate change can alter the weather in two different ways. Firstly, with rising temperatures, we expect more heat waves on average, and warmer air can also hold more water vapor, so we expect more heavy downpours. However, these so-called thermodynamic effects can locally be counteracted or increased by changes in the atmospheric circulation. This is a second effect. For example, climate change can alter the atmospheric circulation in such a way that the low-pressure systems that used to come into a certain region from the sea and bring rain do not reach that region as often as they used to. So the net effect of human-induced climate change on extreme rainfall in that region would be negative, and the risk of such rainfall extremes decreased. To look into the details of such classes of events, and in particular to quantify how the overall risk of a particular type of extreme event has changed, we need climate models. The state-of-the-art climate models are very good in simulating the thermodynamic effect, but on average they are less good in representing the atmospheric circulation well. Some scientists therefore suggested not to try and look at the circulation at all, but just as the effect of higher average temperatures. The attribution question they ask is, given the circulation state of the atmosphere at the time of the event, how did the overall warming influence the event? The answer to this question does not say anything about how likely the atmosphere is ever going to be in that state again. It could be a state that happens at least once a year, or a state we will observe again in 500 years' time. If a stakeholder, for example, seeks information on disaster risk reduction strategies, they might ask the question, how did climate change alter the overall risk of the event occurring? To answer this question, scientists need to look at both the thermodynamic effect from the overall warming and the effect of human-induced climate change on the atmospheric circulation. Thanks to recent developments in the science of event attribution, with new methods and the use of independent models, it is possible to quantify this overall effect of climate change for some classes of extreme events.
All right, if I get the slides to go ahead and advance, here we go. All right, so those efforts by Dr. Otto and others eventually culminated in the formation of a group called the World Weather Attribution, which is an informal network of scientists who do rapid analyses of extreme weather events to determine whether they're caused by climate change. Previously, the work of scientists like Otto would take years after an individual event to try to come up decisively with a conclusion about attribution. However, the work of World Weather Attribution now is able to complete these analyses in a matter of days. The group has done 40 of them so far, trying to distribute information as soon after the event as possible before the public mind starts to wonder. And when this particular headline that you were looking at was looking at the 2022 heat waves, where they concluded that it was virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. In terms of getting attribution science correct, right, finding out which weather events are caused by climate change has been just as important to them as finding out those that are not. Their team concluded, for instance, that Hurricane Harvey in 2017 was made 3 to 4 times more likely by climate change. However, they also concluded that the flooding in Bangladesh that same year was not linked to climate change at all. Now, when you heard Dr. Otto speak, she also talked about, right, looking at the way that carbon dioxide flows through the atmosphere. And part of taking up that challenge has been done in modeling by NASA. And so what we are about to show you is dramatic visualizations that were composed by NASA that show the CO2 emissions, how they build up in the atmosphere over the course of a year. As you watch, take note of, all right. As you watch, take note of the different sources of CO2 emissions. They're from a range. Human-caused burning of fossil fuels is in yellow. Human-caused burning of biomass is in red, and emissions from land ecosystems are in green, and then from the ocean are in blue. The pulsing squares indicate the absorption of CO2 by land ecosystems and the ocean. Also, the visualizations highlight the imbalance of carbon dioxide emissions between the northern and southern hemispheres. And they also show how carbon dioxide is carried around the world on air currents once in the atmosphere. And this is particularly dramatic because as you see, the CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels slowly begin to envelop the entirety of the earth, right, over the period of a year. And like I said, these are models um, attempting to demonstrate, right, the gradual buildup of the amount of CO2 that is pumped into our atmosphere over the course of a year. And you can see in the early part of the model, right, we could actually continue to visualize the southern hemisphere, which was the major sources of the absorption of CO2. And by the end, we could no longer do so. So now we'll switch gears to chapter 6, which is titled The Magic Valley. The Magic Valley actually refers to the Rio Grande Valley, which is a big flat expanse of river bottom that is one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the United States. He focuses a lot of this chapter on how we drain and extract from the Rio Grande Valley. And as a focal point, he opens the chapter talking about the old Hidalgo pump house, which is down in Hidalgo, Texas, right on the border of Mexico, near the end of the journey of the Rio Grande. This pump house was built in 1909 and originally powered by steam, but the pump house pulled water out of the Rio Grande and pushed it into channels that irrigated the entire valley of nearly 40,000 acres. It ran until 1983 when it was, decommissioned and a new pumping station was built. But it's a symbol of the type of extraction that has taken place in the Rio Grande over more than a century now. And the point of it is to talk about the impact of extreme drought. So stretching nearly 1,900 miles from the Colorado Rockies to the Gulf of Mexico, the Rio Grande has sustained entire cultures and nourished wildlife in an otherwise very unforgiving desert region. Nearly every summer, however, since 2018, the river has nearly run dry by the time it reaches El Paso. And that's a dramatic visualization of the dry riverbed on the right hand of your screen from an article in the New York Times. The sources of extraction are numerous. It is drained by farmers. It's also divided by a treaty between US and Mexico. And it is feuded over in courtrooms between the state of New Mexico, the state of Texas, and the state of Colorado. And it is at once one of America's most famous rivers and one of its most abused. Both the Pueblo and the Mansa Native American groups were once sustained by the river, but those ways of life for those people are now impossible because of the way that it has been drained and sucked dry, not only by US agricultural interests, but also things like watering our lawns and preparing golf courses that suck up tons and tons and tons of water in region. And as quoted in the text by one Estela Padilla, age 77, who's lived along the river all her life, when you cut the water off, everything changes. Not only nature, but you change people's way of living, the economy, biodiversity. It's so colossal. It's like a crime scene. Here depicted is Juan Sanchez, age 60, who repairs an irrigation ditch on a 70-acre cornfield east of Edinburgh in the Rio Grande Valley. If the Texas actually pronounced that as Edinburgh, even though it was meant to be modeled after Edinburgh in Scotland. During the drought conditions, Sanchez will work up to 48 hours straight tending to watering the fields and then has a period of 24 hours off. But why this is important and the talk about specifically all the corn that is grown in this region and how the sucking of the Rio Grande dry is also impacting the farming in the region and why we should be concerned. So along the left side of the cornfield here is one of the canals that the pump houses feed from the Rio Grande River. And a lot of that water is going toward the production of corn. It's also going toward the production of watermelon, sour gum, all kinds of other crops, okra. But corn is the industrial food stock of American life. And it is the feedstock for live animals. It is also a massive gasoline additive and is in nearly all American processed foods, whether that be in corn syrup, whether that be in cornstarch, etc., you name it. It was evolved and was cultivated in South Central Mexico with a year-round, that should be 80-degree weather, but it is sensitive to drought. It is additionally vulnerable because big agricorps like Monsanto and BASF have tinkered with the corn genome in such a way that it can grow outside of its natural habitat, but only with the aid of huge amounts of nitrogen fertilizers. And those fertilizers pollute rivers and lakes and create huge algae blooms that kill off all other aquatic life. And an acre of corn growing in 80-degree heat could require as many as 4,000 gallons of water per day. However, in 100-degree heat, so just with a 20-degree rise in temperature, the water needed more than doubles to over 8,000 gallons per day. And so, given how essential corn has become to the American economy and the American agricultural economy, the threat from heat is very serious. And it leads to cascading effects. When corn productivity declines, the usual response is to clear more land to grow more corn. And of course, in clearing more land, we are releasing more carbon into the atmosphere and destroying, right, the things that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, the trees. And it's bad news for places like the Amazon rainforest. It also raises prices on all other food staples, and destabilization of food prices is inextricably linked with political instability and war. And as quoted by one of the persons he follows, Alexis Graceless, who's associate professor of agroecology at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, people will shift crops around, try new varieties, but in the end, there is no getting around the laws of physics and biology. When it gets too hot, things die. That's just how it works. And so the crowning effect of this chapter, of these two chapters, really, in terms of attribution science, this is kind of where we are today. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Sixth Assessment Report of 2022 really put it this forcefully when it said human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people. Beyond natural climate variability, widespread pervasive impacts to ecosystems, people, settlements, and infrastructure have resulted from observed increases in the frequency and intensity of climate and weather extremes, including hot extremes on land and in the ocean, heavy precipitation events, drought, and fire weather. These include increased heat-related human mortality, warm water coral bleaching and mortality, and increased drought-related tree mortality. Climate change has also caused substantial damages and increasingly irreversible losses in terrestrial, freshwater, and coastal and open ocean marine ecosystems. Some losses are already irreversible, such as the first species extinctions driven by climate change. Other impacts are approaching irreversibility, such as impacts of hydrological changes resulting from the retreat of glaciers or the changes in some mountain and Arctic ecosystems driven by permafrost. So with that, I will tag team in my partner, Dr. Bridges. who will take over and talk about the sweat economy.
Thank you. So throughout this book, the author, Jeff Goodell, shares the personal story of many people who have lost their lives from extreme heat. In this chapter, The Sweat Economy, he talks specifically about people who have lost their lives enduring extreme heat conditions while they're working. And this is people who are doing manual labor jobs, doing jobs out in the heat, throughout the hottest days and hottest months, with very little protection and few regulations to protect them. So he says in the book, one of the things you notice living in Texas is that most of the hard, hot work in the fields, on the highways, on the building sites is done by Mexicans or Central Americans. Part of this has to do with the proximity to the border, of course. There are a lot of people from Mexico and Central America here looking for work, and some don't have the papers or the qualifications for a job in an air-conditioned office. Another part of it is the fact that they're willing to do work that others aren't, like install a new roof on a sweltering summer day. But it's also hard not to see the legacy of racism in this. It's usually not overt. It's more often expressed in some version of this. Mexicans are from a hot place, so working in the heat doesn't bother them as much. They're used to it. This is false on several levels. For one thing, Mexico is a big, diverse country with a vast range of ecosystems from high mountains to breezy beaches. All Mexicans are no more used to hot weather than all Californians are. More important, the idea that people who live in hot places are fundamentally better suited to heat than people who live in cold places is not true, at least not in a simple and straightforward way. Some people do have more active sweat glands than others, but that is because of complex physiological processes and genetic variation that have nothing to do with where you live or your race. Neither does the color of your skin. Next slide. In her book, Skin: A Natural History, Nina Jablonski says, infrared radiation is primarily responsible for the heat buildup caused by sunshine, and dark skin and light skin absorb infrared radiation from the sun to nearly equal extents. In the 18th and 19th centuries, heat and racism were deeply entwined. The belief that some races, i.e., non-white, are better suited to heat than others, i.e., whites, was widely held, especially in the antebellum South. It helped provide a moral justification for slavery and allowed slave owners to ignore the horrific working conditions that slaves were subjected to in the cotton fields. So this is a picture of Samuel Cartwright. He was an American physician and racial theorist. You may recognize his name from the made-up mental illness that he talked about called drapetomania, which he described as the madness that a person must be experiencing to attempt to escape from slavery. In his work, he also spread misinformation veiled as science about physiological differences between humans of different races, and specifically about heat adaptation. So he wrote in 1850 to the US Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Next, he says, the practice of Negroes in exposing their bare heads and backs through choice to the rays of the sun hot enough to blister the skin of a white man proves that they are under different physiological laws from him. The labor requiring exposure to a midday summer sun from the laws of the white man's nature cannot be performed in the cotton and sugar region without exposing him to disease and death. Yet the same kind of labor experience proves to be a wholesome and beneficial exercise to the Negro. I had to highlight the words that I thought were the most unbelievable, that he would say through choice. I mean, that obviously that's not what was happening. And that this proves, this is just the circular logic that because they can do this proves that there's some difference. Okay, so he's not alone. Other famous physicians of the time, Philip Tidyman, American physician and plantation owner, said in 1826, protected by the very nature of his constitution from the unhealthiness of hot climates, which are so inimical to whites, especially those who may be necessitated to labor in low, swampy situations. He claimed to have seen enslaved people, quote, working with cheerfulness and alacrity, when the white laborer would become languid and sink from the effects of the torrid sun. Also, William Holcomb, American physician and surgeon and proud defender of slavery, said, quote, the skull of the Negro is very thick, dense, and strong, resisting injuries and the effect of the heat to a wonderful degree. This proves that the Negro, to be organically constituted to be an agricultural laborer in a tropical climate, a strong animal machine. And John Van Every, a Canadian-born American physician and defender of slavery, wrote a pro-slavery pamphlet called Negroes and Negro Slavery, the first an inferior race, the latter its normal condition. In this, he says, quote, the Negro's head is protected by the rays of a vertical sun by a dense mat of woolly hair, wholly impervious to its fiercest heats, while his entire surface, studded with innumerable sebaceous glands, forming a complete excretory system, relieves him from all those climate influences so fatal under the same circumstances to the sensitive and highly organized white man. And even after, the end of slavery and slightly more modern times, these physiological race myths persisted. So in 1908, a federal study on workers and immigration was done, and there was a noted influx of Mexicans into less skilled jobs across the Southwest, especially in construction and agriculture. And from that study, one of the researchers says, quote, they work well and are contented in the desert, where Europeans and Orientals either become dissatisfied or prove unable to withstand the climate. In 1925, a Pittsburgh pipe manufacturer codified stereotypes for 36 groups in a report, in a rating system that they designed called racial adaptability to various types of work. And in this, they gave favorable scores for Mexicans only in jobs that were hot, dry, and dirty. So moving forward, also in the 20s, these persist in our government and our politicians. So in a 1920s immigration debate, William Vail, a US representative from Colorado, said the South was not fitted properly for manual labor by white men. It is hot country and the white man does not thrive under manual labor in the South. And Carlos B., attorney and U.S. representative from Texas, in this same immigration debates, said, the Mexican is a hot weather plant. He does not want to go into a cold climate. He lives in a tropical climate, and he's willing to live in Texas in the summertime. So as you can see, this represents, hundreds of years, basically, of this intentional narrative. And I think you will notice that the words natural was in there a lot, the nature, this is their nature, this is natural, it's beneficial to them to do this, and sort of, invoking this veil of science and biology to describe these different conditions. And I just wanted to point out that this is really the idea of naturalizing inequality. So inequality and hierarchy have not only to be constructed, but also naturalized. So naturalizing inequality and hierarchy is this process by getting scientists and doctors and, respected people to spread these lies and for it to be kind of baked into our society. That leads us to think that inequality and hierarchy are natural, normal, necessary, acceptable, and right. So in this chapter, as I mentioned, he tells a story, of several individuals that died working in extreme heat conditions. He talks about Sebastian Perez, a 38-year-old Guatemalan-born farm worker who died during that heat wave in 2021, working at a nursery growing ornamental, plants like boxwoods for people's, for rich people to put in their yards. And he had, he spoke to his wife back in Guatemala. He spoke to his coworkers. He spoke to the friend that he lived with, and just kind of understood, his last days and the working conditions. And he was out working, in these extremely hot conditions, and there were no regulations at that time. for him to take breaks, to have water, to be in the shade, to stop working at one point in the day when it gets, too hot. So Goodall tells us that, the fact is that heat is killing workers today, and it's getting worse. So thousands and thousands of workers die every year, and it's really naturalized inequality that allows us to accept these deaths. These folks are seen as expendable. There are few regulations for agricultural workers, and even where there are regulations, few are enforced. One of the really tricky things he says that prevents workers from promoting their own safe conditions is that a lot of times nurseries and farms that hire agricultural workers will use an independent labor contractor. So these contractors will find the people and hire them, but then the farms and the nurseries, they will have the rules about the practices. And so your direct employer isn't governing, your conditions. And so who is in charge and who do you complain to and how do you unionize or anything like that? And so it's really in the way that these labor practices are allowed to take place that workers are at the mercy. So it prevents them from speaking up against these unsafe conditions. And more recently, and we'll talk about this in subsequent chapters of the book, but even where there are attempts to make regulations like these 10-minute mandatory breaks for every few hours of work or to have water, politicians lately, this is very recent, from 3 months ago, are fighting back against these and trying to rescind any orders that local municipalities or governments are agreeing to. So in Texas, the Texas governor signed a bill to nullify ordinances enacted by the cities of Austin and Dallas that were wanting to mandate a 10-minute break for construction workers every 4 hours. That is so bare minimum. Can you imagine only being able to break for 10 minutes? And even that is not allowed to be the law. And just to illustrate how needed these regulations are, just a few days after this, governor signed this bill, a 35-year-old utility lineman working to restore power in Marshall, Texas, died from symptoms of heat illness when the heat index reached 100 degrees. 60% of construction workers in Texas are Hispanic or Latino, and they make up 1/3 of all worker heat deaths since 2010. Next slide. So in response to this, governor signing the bill, David Cruz, the communications director for the League of United Latin American Citizens National, a Latino civil rights group, said, "In the midst of a record-setting heat wave, I could not think of a worse time for this governor or any elected official who has any kind of compassion to do this. This administration is incrementally trying to move us backward into a dark time in this nation when plantation owners and agrarian mentalities prevailed." So we have 10 minutes left. What we wanted you all to think about today, and we can talk a little bit about it here, but maybe you carry this on with you as you go about your day or your week. But think about that. How has naturalized inequality played a role in our socialization? What inequities or were we aware of growing up or even aware of current day that we aren't outraged about? I think that's when, to me, that's what naturalized inequality is. It's you see this and you aren't just fully outraged. Also, what is the legacy of physiological race myths in science and in medicine? And then I think our overall question for this book is, what are the obstacles to our culture, to our society, reorganizing the way that we live, the way that we vote, the way that we shop, the way that we, create policies for workers to stop overheating the planet. Since it's just a really small group, we should just stay together and talk.
Well, I was going to put them in the.
Do it.
I'll put the questions in the chat, and we'll stop share there.
Mm-hmm.